James Carter had worked in the same office building for more than 30 years. Every morning before the sun rose, he would put on his faded blue uniform, lace up his old work boots, and catch the early bus into the city. The building was tall, with shiny glass windows that reflected the sky, and inside it smelled of coffee, perfume, and the faint scent of paper and ink. James was the janitor, the man who swept the floors, emptied the trash, and polished the tables until they shone. Too. Most people who worked there, James was invisible. He walked quietly through the hallways, pushing his cleaning cart, while executives in expensive suits brushed past him without a glance. Sometimes they would mumble a quick morning, but more often than not, they said nothing at all. James didn't mind, at least, not on the surface. He had learned long ago that some people only saw the job, not the person doing it. He was older now, with gray hair and lines on his face that told stories of years gone by. His hands were rough from years of scrubbing floors and carrying heavy trash bags. But behind his calm, tired eyes was a sharp mind, one that remembered faces, overheard conversations, and understood more about the building's business than anyone guessed. Every day, while sweeping under desks or wiping down conference tables, he would notice little details. Papers left open, emails displayed on computer screens, and numbers scribbled on notepads. James had no fancy degree, no corner office, and no big title. But what he had was something more valuable: patience, observation, and a quiet determination. In the evenings, when the office emptied out and only the faint hum of the air conditioning remained, James would take a moment to stand by the big window on the top floor. From there, he could see the whole city, with its flickering lights and endless streets. He often thought about how many people worked hard every day, but were never truly seen. Just like him, he wasn't bitter, at least not in a way that made him angry, but he was aware of how the world worked. The executives he cleaned up after believed they were the smartest people in the building. They believed success was about suits, money, and power. They never thought that the quiet man with the mop might understand their business better than they did. Still, James kept to himself. He listened more than he spoke, smiled politely when spoken to, and never gave anyone a reason to think he was anything more than just the janitor. But inside, he carried a truth no one knew. Over the years, he had been slowly building something. With the little money he earned, he made careful investments. He read books from the library about finance, business, and leadership. He learned to read financial statements the same way he read a stain on a carpet, looking for the hidden spots others missed. And while the executives thought he was simply polishing their desks, James was also polishing his knowledge. He understood the company's weaknesses and strengths, knew who the real decision-makers were, and even knew which employees were honest and which ones cut corners. The funny thing about being overlooked is that it gives you the perfect place to watch and learn. No one hides their conversations around someone they think doesn't matter. No one lowers their voice for the janitor. James became the invisible witness to years of deals, arguments, and secrets. And while others might have wasted that position, James took it as a gift. He had seen the company rise and fall, survive recessions, and celebrate big wins. He had seen young interns grow into managers, and some managers fall from grace. Through it all, he stayed, cleaning up the mess, seas both literal and figurative, that others left behind. James Carter was the man they overlooked, the man who blended into the background like the hum of the lights or the smell of the coffee machine. But what they didn't know was that he was waiting for the right moment, waiting for the day when being invisible would no longer be a disadvantage. But his greatest weapon, James, was halfway through his morning routine when it happened. He had just finished mopping the marble floor in the lobby, his reflection gliding along the wet surface when the phone at the security desk rang. The security guard, a young man who usually gave James a quick nod but rarely spoke, called out to him, "Hey, Mr. Carter," he said, holding the receiver out. "This one's for you." James frowned. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had called him at work, let alone on the security desk phone. Slowly, he walked over and took the receiver. "Mr. Carter," came a firm voice on the other end. "We need you to come to the top floor. Right now." James almost laughed. The top floor was the boardroom level. He'd been there many times, but always to vacuum carpets, wipe down long wooden tables, or polish the silver coffee carafes before an important meeting. Nobody ever called him there during the day, especially not in the middle of a meeting. "Is something wrong?" he asked cautiously. There was a pause, then the voice replied, "Just come. Bring that folder you keep in your locker." And then the line went dead. James stood still for a moment, the receiver hanging in his hand. The folder, nobody should have known about it. He kept it hidden behind a stack of cleaning rags, away from curious eyes. It wasn't just any folder, was his folder. The one he had been quietly filling for years with printed reports, copies of financial statements, contracts left in the recycling bin, and notes he'd made in his neat handwriting. With a slow inhale, James placed the mop back in its bucket and walked to his small storage room. The smell of bleach and floor polish greeted him. He reached up, moved the stack of old rags, and pulled down the thick, slightly worn folder. His name was not written on it. There was no label at all, just a plain manila cover, the edges frayed from years of being handled. He tucked it under his arm and made his way to the elevator. As the doors closed, he caught his reflection in the shiny metal. Blue uniform, name tag, work boots that had seen better days. He looked like a janitor heading upstairs to fix a spill, not someone about to walk into the most powerful room in the building. The elevator chimed, and the doors opened to a carpeted hallway with gold nameplates on each office door. The air smelled different here, like expensive cologne and fresh flowers. As James stepped out, a young assistant in a fitted suit spotted him. "Oh," she said with a confused smile. They're waiting for you in the boardroom." She hesitated, as if unsure whether she should even let him in. But then she opened the tall wooden door. The room was big, with a polished oak table stretching almost the entire length, floor to ceiling. Windows let in the bright morning light, casting sharp reflections on the table's glossy surface. Around it sat the executives, men and women in tailored suits, each with a leather binder in front of them. A few of them looked up when James entered, their brows knitting in confusion. One of them chuckled softly. Another leaned toward the person next to him and whispered something, making them smirk. "This must be a mistake," said a tall man with silver hair. "We're in the middle of a quarterly review." James didn't speak. He just stood there, folder in hand. He noticed the CEO at the far end of the table, watching him with an unreadable expression. Finally, the CEO raised a hand to quiet the room. "Mr. Carter," he said slowly, "please have a seat." James glanced around. He had never been offered a seat here before. He had stood in this room dozens of times while scrubbing coffee, stains from the carpet or dusting picture frames, but he had never once sat at the table. He walked to the empty chair near the middle, placed the folder gently in front of him, and sat down. The leather chair felt strange beneath him, soft, expensive, almost too comfortable. The executives exchanged puzzled looks. One cleared his throat. "Why is the janitor here?" James didn't answer. Instead, he opened the folder, revealing neat stacks of documents, each secured with paper clips. The sound of the clasp opening seemed to echo in the quiet room. He slid the first document forward, the paper crisp and clean. He didn't start explaining right away. He let the room settle into its own curiosity. He knew that in a place like this, silence could be more powerful than words. The laughter was gone now. The smirks had faded, and for the first time in his long career, James Carter felt the eyes of the entire board fixed on him, not as a janitor, but as a man who clearly had something they didn't expect. The boardroom air felt heavier than usual. The quiet hum of the air conditioner filled the space as James Carter sat in the leather chair, the plain manila folder resting in front of him. His hands weathered, steady rested on top of it, and his eyes calmly scanned the room. Around the table, the executives shifted in their seats. A few crossed their arms. One tapped his pen against the table. A sharp click, 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 echoing in the silence. They didn't know why the janitor had been called here, and they didn't like not knowing. The man with the silver hair, the same one who had laughed earlier, leaned back and said loudly enough for the whole room to hear, "Well, this should be interesting. Did someone spill coffee on the carpet again?" A few chuckles rippled around the table, but they were forced, uncertain. The laughter didn't have the same easy arrogance it had when James first walked in. Something about the way he sat and bothered, almost patient, made them uneasy. James didn't react to the remark. He simply opened the folder. The faint rustle of papers seemed to pull every eye toward him. Slowly, carefully, he took out the first document and placed it on the table, not sliding it toward anyone in particular. It was a financial report one. They all recognized, but James' copy had something different. Bright red marks circling figures, notes written neatly in the margins, arrows pointing from one number to another. It was the kind of careful work an auditor might do, but James was no auditor. Or so they thought. "What exactly is this?" asked a woman in a navy suit, her voice sharp. James looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "It's something I've been keeping track of for a while," someone snorted. "Keeping track? Of what?" "Dust bunnies under our desks." This time, a few more chuckles filled the air. James let the noise pass. Then he leaned back slightly and said in a steady voice, "Numbers don't lie, but people do." That stopped the laughter. The CEO, who had been silent until now, leaned forward and clasped his hands. His eyes were locked on James, his face still unreadable. "Go on," he said quietly. James nodded and reached for the second document. This one was a printout of an internal email chain several months old. He didn't explain it immediately. He simply laid it beside the first paper and let the executive's eyes skim over the bolded subject line and the dates. Some of them frowned. One man's face went pale. "You went through our emails," someone blurted, half outraged, half afraid. "I clean this building," James said evenly. "People leave things behind, on desks, in printers, in recycling bins. You'd be surprised what you find when no one thinks you're looking." The room went still. That was when James noticed something change the way their eyes moved, the way their bodies leaned slightly forward. They weren't laughing. Now, they were searching his face for clues, trying to measure how much he knew. James wasn't about to tell them. Not yet. He could feel the power shift. Just minutes ago, he was the overlooked janitor in a room full of high-paid executives. Now, they were leaning toward him, unsettled, curious, and perhaps just a little afraid. And James Carter, the man they had ignored for decades, had only shown them the first 2 pages of what he carried. The CEO's voice broke the tension. "Mr. Carter, why don't you tell us exactly why you're here?" James looked at him for a long moment, his eyes calm and steady. Then, without breaking eye contact, he closed the folder gently and said, "Because it's time you all heard the truth." The words hung in the air like heavy smoke. "Because it's time you all heard the truth." For a moment, nobody moved. A few executives glanced at each other, unsure whether to speak or stay quiet. The man with silver hair cleared his throat, but before he could say anything, the CEO raised a hand to silence the room. James Carter placed his palm gently on the folder. then slid out another document, a thick set of printed financial statements, stapled in the corner. The pages were covered with red circles, arrows, and handwritten notes. He set them in the middle of the table, close enough for everyone to see. "These," he began in a calm, almost quiet voice, "are your quarterly expense reports from the last 3 years." One of the executives scoffed. "We see those all." "The time? What's your point?" James' eyes flicked toward the man. "The point," he said evenly, "is that there are numbers here that shouldn't exist. Payments to companies that don't exist. Vendor contracts for services that were never provided. Money? That's missing." The scoffing stopped. Chairs creaked as people leaned in to look at the pages. A woman near the end of the table took one of the reports in her hands, flipping quickly through the figures. Her eyebrows knitted together. This isn't possible," she muttered. Double quotes. "Oh, it's possible," James replied. "It's just not legal." The silence in the room deepened. James continued, his tone steady, his words deliberate. "I've been cleaning these offices for decades. I've seen executives come and go, seen the good ones work hard. And I've seen the bad ones steal right under everyone's noses. Most people don't notice because they're too busy looking up the corporate ladder. But I'm not on the ladder. I'm on the ground, looking in every direction. I see what others miss." He reached into the folder again and pulled out something smaller, a photograph. He set it down on the table. It was a blurry picture of 2 men shaking hands in a dimly lit restaurant. One of the men was seated at this very table now. The man's face drained of color. Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. James didn't answer him directly. "The problem with doing business in public places," he said, "is that you never know who else might be there. Maybe a waiter. Maybe another customer. Or maybe a janitor taking a rare night off who just happens to see the wrong handshake." Murmur ran through the room. Someone whispered to the person next to them. Someone else stared down at their binder, avoiding James' eyes. Then James reached for the last document he planned to reveal for now. It was a letter, printed on company letterhead, authorizing a transfer of funds to an offshore account. It was signed by 2 executives in the room. When James placed it on the table, it was as if the air left the room. The tension was no longer just curiosity, was fear. Real fear. "I didn't come here to clean today," James said finally. "I came here to warn you. What I know, what I have here," he tapped the folder lightly, "is enough to bring this company to the ground in a single day." He let that sink in, but, he added slowly, "it's also enough to save it. If you make the right choice." The CEO, still silent, leaned back in his chair and studied James carefully, as though trying to decide whether the man in front of him was an ally or the most dangerous person in the room. The room was no longer just tense, it was suffocating. The large windows let in bright daylight, but it felt as if the shadows in the corners were growing thicker. No one was laughing anymore. No one was whispering either. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the slow, deliberate sound of James Carter turning another page. He pulled out a document that was thicker than the others, more than 100 pages, neatly bound. The cover read, "Internal audit, confidential, not for distribution." It wasn't a report the board was supposed to see yet. In fact, some of them clearly recognized it the second it hit the table. A man in a gray suit leaned forward sharply. "Where did you get that?" "That's an internal compliance draft." James' eyes didn't waver. "Where I get things isn't important. What matters is what's inside." He flipped it open to a marked page and slid it across the table. "Page 43. Have a look." A woman with sharp glasses grabbed the binder and scanned the page. Her hand froze halfway down, her lips parted slightly. Then she looked up at the CEO. This is bad. James spoke before anyone else could. Those offshore accounts you thought no one knew about. I know. The ghost employees listed on payroll? I know. The shell companies created just to funnel cash. I know. Every cent, every name, every date. It's all there. Someone at the far end of the table slammed a palm against the wood. This is outrageous. You can't just walk in here, and I can. James interrupted, his voice still calm, almost quiet, but cutting through the man's words like a blade. And I have. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the edge of the table. Do you think I've been cleaning floors all these years without learning how to clean up something much bigger? I've been watching, waiting. Every late night I stayed after hours. Every early morning I came in before you. I was collecting pieces of a puzzle you didn't even know existed. And now the picture is complete. The executives shifted uncomfortably, their polished confidence cracking like thin glass. One of them rubbed his temple, another loosened his tie. The man from the photograph kept his eyes on the table, as though avoiding James' gaze might erase what was already in front of him. James placed a small USB drive on the table. It was ordinary black, worn, unremarkable. But its weight in the room was immense. Everything in this folder, he said, tapping the stack of documents. It's backed up here. Every file, every email, every transaction. And it's not just in my possession. It's already been sent to 3 safe places. If anything happens to me, or if this meeting ends without the right outcome, it all goes public, instantly. Cold silence fell over the room. The CEO finally spoke, his voice low and measured. Mr. Carter, what do you want? James looked at him for a long moment before answering. I want this company cleaned up not with bleach and a mop, but from the top down. No more lies, no more theft. And I want the people who built this business honestly to be the ones steering it forward, not the ones bleeding it dry. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The power in his words came from the truth they carried, and the fact that everyone in that room knew he could deliver on his threat. James sat back in his chair, the folder still open, the USB drive resting like a silent ultimatum in the center of the table. For the first time since he entered, all the executives weren't looking at each other. They were all looking at him. And in that moment, the janitor who had been invisible for decades became the most important man in the building. For several long seconds, the boardroom was silent. It wasn't the silence of boredom or dismissal, it was the heavy, tight kind of silence that wraps around a room when everyone knows the ground beneath them has shifted. James Carter sat still, his back straight, his expression calm. The manila folder lay open, the USB drive glinting faintly in the light. He didn't move. He didn't need to. The power had already shifted into his hands. One of the younger executives, a man in a Navy suit whose confidence had been melting, since James started speaking, finally broke. Look, we can talk about this. Surely there's a way to resolve things without. James tilted his head slightly. Without what? Without the truth coming out. Without the people who have been stealing for years facing consequences. Without the people who've been trampled finally getting a voice. The younger man's mouth opened, then closed again. The woman with sharp glasses who had been scanning James' documents earlier leaned forward. If what you say is true, this could destroy us. James nodded once. Yes, and maybe it should if you refuse to fix it. The man with the silver hair, who had been smirking earlier, now leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. Right. Let's cut to it. You came here for something? Money, right? That's what this is about. James looked at him without a flicker of emotion. I have money, more than you think. What I don't have on, what I want is honesty in this building. I want the people who work here to stop looking over their shoulders. I want every dollar in the books to be clean. I want the name of this company to mean something again. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now. Something sharp and unshakable. The CEO spoke up for the first time in several minutes. "Mr. Carter," he said carefully, "you have to understand that exposing all of this at once could trigger an investigation that, well, it wouldn't just hurt the guilty. It could cost hundreds of innocent employees their jobs." James didn't hesitate. "Then we don't expose it all at once. We clean it quietly, effectively. But that only works if you're willing to strip the rot out of the walls. That means certain people at this table," he said, glancing deliberately toward two specific executives, "will need to go." Immediately, gasps rippled through the room. One of the men he had looked at flushed bright red. "You can't, I can," James interrupted. "And I will. Because if you don't, that USB drive leaves this building before the day is over." The words hit like a hammer. No one spoke. The faint tick of the wall clock became suddenly loud. Then, something happened James had been expecting, but still took a certain satisfaction in seeing the tone in the room changed. The arrogance, the snide remarks, the dismissive smirks. They were gone. In their place came softer voices, cautious questions, and careful offers. One executive leaned forward, her voice low. "Mr. Carter, maybe you should be part of the solution. We could bring you on as a consultant, let you help restructure things. Quietly, no one outside this room would even have to know." James studied her for a moment. "You mean you do?" "Rather by my silence than change your behavior." She hesitated. "We'd rather avoid chaos." James gave a small, humorless smile. "Chaos comes when you ignore the truth, not when you face it." The bargaining had begun, and James knew this was the moment they'd try to pull him into their world with soft promises and hidden strings. But what they didn't understand was that James Carter wasn't here for a deal. He was here to decide who would stay, who would go, and how deep the cleanup would cut, and for the first time in their lives. The people at the top realized the janitor had the power to sweep them out of the building. The bargaining didn't surprise James. He had expected it. He'd expected the lowered voices, the sudden politeness, the careful choice of words. That's how people with power behaved when they realized they were losing it. They tried to reshape the game so they could still win. But this wasn't their game anymore. James leaned back in his chair, resting one hand on the manila folder and the other on the USB drive. His eyes moved slowly around the table, meeting each pair of eyes without flinching. "I've been thinking," he began quietly, "about how many years I've spent in this building. 32, to be exact." No one spoke. "I started here making less in a year than some of you spend on a watch," he continued. "But I saved, I invested. And I didn't invest in fancy cars or big houses. I invested in this company every spare dollar, every bonus, every extra shift's pay." A few brows furrowed. The CEO's head tilted slightly, as if he were beginning to understand where this was going. "That means," James went on, "over 3 decades of paychecks. I became more than just your janitor. I became a shareholder." The room shifted. Uneasily, James' voice stayed calm, almost conversational. "And when the stock dipped, I bought more. When the market panicked, I stayed steady. Over the years, those little pieces I bought share by share did up." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle. "As of last quarter, I am now the single largest individual shareholder in this company." It was like dropping a stone into deep water. The ripple was silent but unstoppable. Several executives blinked, trying to process what they'd just heard. A man near the end of the table mouthed something under his breath. "You can't be serious," the man with silver hair finally said. His voice tight. James slid a printed shareholder report out of the folder and placed it in front of them. His name was there, plain as day, right near the top. Dead serious, he said. One of the executives flipped through the pages, his hands shaking slightly. This changes everything. Yes, James agreed. It does. Because, as the majority shareholder, I now have the legal authority to vote on board changes, including removals. The weight of that statement filled the room. The people who once laughed at him were now pale, stiff in their seats. James straightened. His posture, his voice sharpening just enough to cut through the thick air. Today, 2 of you will resign before you leave this room. You know who you are. His gaze lingered on the guilty parties. Neither dared to speak. He continued from, "This moment on, this company will run with transparency. Salaries and bonuses will be tied to performance, not to backroom deals. Contracts will be earned, not bought. And every dollar will be accounted for. If anyone here has a problem with that, I'll make sure their problem becomes public knowledge." By the end of the day, the silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't just fear, it was surrender. They knew the janitor they had overlooked for decades was now the man who controlled their fate. The CEO exhaled slowly. "Mr. Carter, it appears the floor is yours." James gave a small nod. "It always has been. You just never noticed." The boardroom was silent, except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Every person seated at the table wore the same look, part disbelief, part fear, part reluctant respect. James Carter closed the manila folder slowly, pressing the edges together until the papers inside sat neatly in place. He picked up the USB drive and slid it back into his pocket. His movements were calm, deliberate. The way a man moves when he knows the outcome is already his. Across from him, the 2 executives he had named earlier avoided his gaze completely. Their faces were pale, their bodies stiff. Teeny what they had to do, and they knew they had no way out. The CEO cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, I believe we understand the terms." James gave a single nod. "Good." He stood up, the leather chair sighing as it pushed back. His boots made a soft thud against the carpet as he walked toward the head of the table. He didn't rush. Every step seemed to echo in the quiet room. When he reached the far end, he stopped beside the CEO, resting one hand on the back of the chair. "For decades," he began, his voice steady but deep, "I've walked into this room only to clean up after you. Coffee stains, crumbs, spilled water. Messes you never thought twice about." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the faces in front of him. But messes aren't just made on the floor. Sometimes they're made in ledgers, in contracts, in quiet conversations behind closed doors. And those messes take a different kind of cleaning. No one spoke. No one dared to. James straightened and took one step toward the door. Then he turned back, his gaze locking with each person at the table in turn. "Next time," he said slowly, "treat the janitor with respect. You never know who's holding the keys to the building and the company." The words landed heavy, each one pressing into the silence like a stamp sealing the moment in history. He opened the door, and the bright hallway light spilled into the room. Without another word, James walked out. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving the boardroom. In a heavy, motionless quiet, down the hall, he passed the young assistant who had let him in earlier. She looked at him, wide-eyed, as if sensing that something monumental had just happened. James gave her a small, knowing nod and kept walking. By the time he reached the elevator, he could feel the shift not in the air, but in himself. For 32 years, he had been invisible in this building. Today, he had become the most visible man in it. And as the elevator doors closed in front of him, James Carter allowed himself the smallest of smiles. The company was his now. In name alone, but in control, in truth, and in the respect they could never take back. And somewhere deep inside, he knew this wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for every person who had ever been underestimated.